Okay, today we'll cover two topics. One is config map in Kubernetes and other one is secret. So let's start with the config map. Okay. So yesterday we learned how to create a volume and why there is a need for a volume because if we want to save the uh, large data, okay, uh, of the application, the pod is ephemeral. That's why we need a volume, Kubernetes volume. So yesterday we saw how to create a volume and how to mount it on a pod. Similarly, suppose there is some non-sensitive data such as key value pairs, uh, or any configuration data which is required for an application to run properly. Okay, that data will also be lost. Okay, some custom configurations which we want, which is not available by default in a pod, that non-sensitive data also will get lost when the pod gets restarted. So we need to store this config map as well somewhere. Okay, so there where that is where the config map is used. Okay, so that config map can be used as an environmental variables or command line arguments or files and volumes. Okay, so for example, if you want to set a database host, database underscore host as an environmental variable, similarly database password. Okay, but that password will be part of a secret because that is a sensitive data, and for non-sensitive data we'll be using config map. Okay, so we'll be using something called config map. Okay, that is also kind of a volume but not same as the Kubernetes volume. The name is volume, but don't get confused with it. We'll see that in the example. But remember, that config volume is used for non-sensitive data. Persistent volume is used to uh, request storage resources for your application. So how we define config map? This is one of the example. Whatever configuration we need to define. Okay, here I have given some index.html example, but in exercise we'll be doing something else. So the kind will be config map. Okay, we'll give some name and we will just call it. Calling it is just same as volume. Okay, but here the name is config map. So don't get confused with the config map and volumes. Okay, so everything is same. Okay, but the name is here config map. So secret will cover later. So there's just a short theory for config map. So again I'll explain that for non-sensitive data we'll be using config map. So we will start with this exercise, that is exercise number 12. Okay, Nginx config map to run Nginx on a custom port. Okay, so why I'm saying custom port, you all remember that. Let's see if I already have any pod running. So we have Nginx pod running. So kubectl exec hyphen it. Let's go inside the pod, that is Nginx pod hyphen slash bin bash. Okay, and if I do curl localhost inside the pod, we know that Nginx runs on port 80, right? We do not have to give any other port number, right? 8088, it won't run because by default the Nginx runs on port 80, and for that, for making it run on port 80, we haven't made any changes in the configuration file. Okay, that is already available in slash etc nginx cat. Let's see what's inside nginx. Okay, here it is. conf.t ct conf.t. We have this default configuration file. Okay, in this configuration file here, it is defined that it is running on port 80. Okay, due to this, by default it runs on port 80, that is curl localhost will give output as, that was it will give output on port 80. And suppose we have to make it run on port 8080, this is the configuration change. Okay, so this is the configuration change which I was talking about. So if I make it 8080, okay, if I make it 8080, I restart nginx. Okay, but when the pod get restarted, it will come back to 80, but we want that it should always listen on port 8080. Okay, that's where the config map will be used. So same thing we'll be doing, okay, but in a new exercise. So I just wanted to give an example of a config map. Similarly, if we have mysql.conf or any configuration related data, okay, or we need to set some environmental variable which should have some data, that also we can set with the config data. Again, I'll say for non-sensitive data we'll be using config map. For sensitive data we'll be using Kubernetes secret, okay, which we'll see next in next exercise. And for storing the large data, we'll be using external volumes, okay, that is Kubernetes volumes. So let me do the cleanup and then we'll start the exercise. I'll also delete the PVC. So everything is clean now. So let's start the exercise. So I'm adding it as configmap exercise, creating a folder, and inside that will create our YML files. So I'm first creating configmap.yml. So what what is the syntax? Just add here a kind as config map, okay, the name of the config map, and then we say data. What is the data? That the non-sensitive data, it will be nginx.conf file with this configuration details. Okay, so we are making it run, okay, by default the nginx will run on port 8070 instead of 80. These changes we want to be persistent. Okay, that's why we are creating it nginx. Okay, other things are default settings of nginx. Now just do kubectl apply. So kubectl get config map will give us the details of any configurations defined here on this cluster in a default namespace. So by default something called kuberoot ca.crt is there, but that is used by Kubernetes. Okay, so apart from that we do not have anything else here. So when we do kubectl get config map, we'll get all the details of whatever config maps defined on in the default namespace. So we don't have anything. Kubectl apply -f, this will create the config map. If we check get config map, we'll see we have created nginx config map. Just describe it, we'll get more information what it has. Kubectl describe config map nginx config map. So if you see, it has some data in nginx.conf. Okay, and these are the configuration details inside it. Now we will create nginx deployment with this custom config file details. So I'll quickly explain it. We are creating an nginx deployment, one replica. Okay, image is nginx. Okay, until now by default we were using container port as 80, but now we'll make it 8070 because we are making it run on a custom port instead of 8080. Instead of 80, we are making it run on 8070. So this is the change, and again the syntax is same like volume. Okay, so we are defining here as a volume, but it is not like the Kubernetes volume. It is for the config map. So the name of the volume is name of the config is nginx config volume. Okay, the name is nginx config. Okay, and we are mounting that on /etc nginx conf.d. Okay, so instead inside that conf.d, our custom file nginx-config.conf will be saved. Okay, so this is how its syntax is, and just apply it. Kubectl apply -f nginx deployment, kubectl get all. Okay, the container is getting created, and this is important. We are making it run on a node port. So deployment we have created. Now we are creating a service, nginx service svc.yml. Okay, so if you see, we are creating an nginx service, making it run as a node port. Okay, so see, if you see we are defining here a port on 80. 80 means on cluster IP it will work on port 80. Okay, but the target port means port on which the backend pod is running, that is inside the pod it will be running on port 8070. And as we are defining as node port on this VMs, some port would be open in range 30,000 and above. Okay, so remember this is important. Port is 80, but it is for the service. Service means the virtual layer. Uh, that means when we do curl cluster the IP, it will work properly on port 80, but inside the container it is running on port 8070, and node port means it will open a port on this particular host. So just to kubectl apply -f nginx service.yml, kubectl get all. Okay, so we have deployment running. Okay, uh, on cluster IP, that is on service. If we do curl, okay, it is giving the default nginx page. Okay, and so we won't notice the much difference, but it is running inside the container on port 8070. 192.168.1.11, this particular port. Okay, it is working. Now let's go inside the container. Again we'll see kubectl get all and config map, both we can check. So we have this config map, we have this deployment, we have the service, and we have the pod. Kubectl exec execute -it interactive terminal for the pod --bin bash. Okay. So if I do curl localhost, okay, by default port 80 is not working. 8070 it will work. 8070. Okay. So this is one of the simple example I can think of to give the demo of config map, but in production there will be different scenarios based on the application. Okay, so this was all about the exercise for config map. Any questions?